Hi guys, this is part 3 of the call. The different events going on between 1953 and 1962 and the following periods too. Well, what happened after Stalin? After the death of Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev was elected first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. With him, a new period started, the de-Stalinization process. The de-Stalinization process consisted in eliminating the cult to the leader Stalin, but also some other measures such as eliminating the gulags or rehabilitating old politicians that had been imprisoned by Stalin. In the meantime, in America, the Republican Eisenhower is going to occupy the White House. He's going to govern from 1953 to 1961, when John F. Kennedy was elected. He was a Democrat who will face some things as the invasion of Bay of Pigs in Cuba, the missiles crisis, the construction of the Berlin Wall, or the first interventions in Vietnam, to be finally killed in 1963, having governed only 2 to 3 years. These are the events that are going to be the most important in this period. You're going to start with the Hungarian Revolution, the Berlin Wall being built, the Suez crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Revolution. Well, with the de-Stalinization process and reforms, open critics started in Hungary. Different political groups asked for freedom to choose their own politicians and political systems independent from the Soviet Union. In October 1956, a student protest turned into a revolt when thousands joined the streets and went to the Hungarian parliament, where they wanted to broadcast on the radio their message. What happened is that the army opened fire, and when the news were heard by the people of Hungary, the revolution spread. They dissolved the communist government and set their own government with Imre Nagy, who was their president. When they announced their plans to abandon the Pact of Warsaw, the Soviet tanks entered in Budapest and brutally crushed the Hungarian Revolution. The president, Imre Nagy, was executed, and a new one, called János Kádár, was imposed by the Politburo, by the Soviet Union. With this, the Soviet Union was making clear that the end of the Stalin era didn't mean that the different satellite states were going to have freedom. It was a change regarding the Stalin time, but it didn't mean more freedom for the satellite states. Now with the Suez crisis, it happened in July 1956, and well, the Suez Canal was owned by the Suez Canal Company that was under British and French protection. It has enormous economic importance, but even more strategic, as it was owned during World War II because of the location. In July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, decided to nationalize the Canal of Suez. In response, Israel, France, and Britain planned a joint military operation to invade Egypt and take Nasser out of power. When the Soviets threatened to intervene, the United Nations, seeing the risk of this war, opposed the invasion of Egypt and forced the retreat of France and England, who lost most of their influence in this area, in which, remember, they used to have colonial influence. It was a victory for the Egyptians and a real setback for France and England. The Berlin Wall. Well, this is very, very famous, but you have to know that it didn't happen from the beginning. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and it was built due to the following reasons. Well, remember that not only Germany but also Berlin was divided in two. West Berlin, part of the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Berlin, capital of the Democratic Republic of Germany. This last is communist. As the Federal Republic was more prosperous due to the good economic evolution of capitalism in the 50s, and the inhabitants lived in a democracy, a lot of Berliners from the east moved to the west. In 1961, to end this mass migration, imagine from 1951 to 1958, more than 2 million Berliners left for the West. The GDR built the Berlin Wall that divided the city up to, when the Berlin Wall fell? I was already alive, 1989. Well, the consequences were that West Berlin got really isolated, and it became the symbol of the Cold War, as well as loss of prestige for the Soviet Union. The Western democracy said, at least we don't have to build a wall surrounding our countries to keep our own inhabitants in. This is a diagram of how the wall was designed. One of the historical texts that come in the exam. It's I Am a Berliner by John F. Kennedy. You have to read it. Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be one of the most tense periods of the Cold War. And because of that, it's really, really famous. To understand what happened, we have to know that Fidel Castro in 1958 led a revolution against the dictatorship of Batista, dictatorship that counted with the support of the USA. Remember the Truman Doctrine of intervening in the rest of America. Fidel Castro is going to establish a communist regime, pro-Soviet regime, that immediately is going to be considered a threat by the USA. Because of this, in 1961, a group of anti-Castro Cuba exiles that were living in the Americas, supported by the US government, tried an invasion of the island, occupying the Bay of Pigs, Bahía de Cochinos, on the southwest coast of the island. The attack failed. It was a tremendous failure. But the open aggression is going to make Castro come closer to the Soviet Union, looking for protection, looking for allies. In 1962, USA placed several anti-nuclear missiles in Turkey, pointing to the Soviet Union. And well, as a response to both facts, both the attack on Bahía de Cochinos and the installing of missiles in Turkey, Nikita Khrushchev, secretary, started to install nuclear missiles in Cuba too. With these missiles, the Soviet Union could reach most of the North American territory. So imagine the situation. At the beginning of the year 1962, it was an American spy airplane that took a photo, a normal photo of the Soviet missiles. It was a common operation that happened almost every week. They were looking for, they were airplanes that were spies, and they were looking for different things. And in this case, to their surprise, in this picture, they were able to see that the Soviet Union was installing missiles in Cuba. So in this moment, imagine the tension is going to rise enormously. And Kennedy decided to set a naval blockade on Cuba and threatened to attack Cuba if the Soviets didn't remove their missiles. Tension so came to a maximum point when the American and the Soviet warship met in the sea. They're gonna met, like you can see in this picture, they're gonna met, and what's gonna happen now? The boats, the warship were facing each other. Finally, in this moment of really, really, really dangerous moment, Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy to reach an agreement and ordered to stop and to withdraw the missiles in Cuba in exchange for the Americans doing the same with the missiles in Turkey, and the promise by the Americans of not invading Cuba. The Americans did it straight after the crisis, did and agreed to this, but in secret. After Cuban Missile Crisis and due to the belief of the mutual assured destruction, it is a theory that it's known as MAD, the Mutual Assured Destruction Theory. The red phone was set. The first version wasn't really a phone, but it was a telegraph to avoid confusion of simultaneous translation. But this is the origin of the red phone. So the two leaders of these two great enemy countries could talk easily, because it was quite difficult for Kennedy and Khrushchev to have these peace conversations during the terrible crisis. This is how far the missiles could reach from Cuba. They could bomb most of the United States. This is the third period of the Cold War, 1963-1973, and this period is opened with a great advance toward coexisting. After the tension during the Cuban crisis missiles, USA and Soviet Union realized how close they had come to a nuclear war and decided to sit down and talk. The result are going to be these two agreements. The first, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, space or sea. And the second and more important, the Strategic Arm Limitation TAC, known as SALT Treaty, which limited the amount of nuclear weapons. For the first time, they were limiting the amount of nuclear weapons. It was a huge step, as we are living a time of nuclear panic. It was common to have nuclear refugees in private houses as well as in every government institutions. It was common also that in schools the kids were told how to they have to react in case of a nuclear attack, how they had to find a refuge and how they had to act. So it is a huge step, but this doesn't mean that we are not going to have different conflicts. The first conflict is going to be inside the Soviet territory. Well, the Prague Spring is known as the Prague Spring. Something similar to the Hungarian Revolution happened in other of their satellite states. Everything started with the election of a new reformist leader of the Communist Party on Czechoslovakia called Alexander Dubček. He introduced liberal reforms, establishing less censorship and more freedom. It was the beginning of the democratization process of the country, and it has been the only Communist Party who did it, who carried them out. However, the Soviet Union feared its expansion to other satellite states and sent the troops to Prague, forcing the Czech government to abandon the reforms. This time of changes was known as the Prague Spring, very famous because it had been a peaceful try to walk towards democracy, and once more the Soviet Union had said no. The Warsaw Pact stopped it. This picture that you can see, a man facing a tank, became world war known, and it's a symbol of the Prague Spring. In the Middle East, well, the next conflict, the Yom Kippur War, what happened? We have to go back to World War II to understand this. The solutions the United Nations gave to the Jew problem after World War II was the creation of the State of Israel. This option is going to be surrounded by problems since the beginning. such as the opposition of the Arabic countries surrounding the new Israel territory. Also, this new territory was a really strategic area, and it has really rich oil deposits. So in 1973, after different tensions and different aggressions, the Yom Kippur War is going to start when the Arab countries invaded Israel. However, Israel counterattacked, gaining even more land. The USA supported Israel, and the Soviet Union supported the Arab countries. Even though the war finished, there were great consequences as the Arab countries imposed an oil embargo and reduced the oil production, trying to pressure the Western Bloc not to support Israel. Israel had won the war because it was stronger than the Arab countries. But the Arab countries weren't satisfied, and they had another weapon, another very powerful weapon, and that was oil. And they decided to use it. With this embargo, with this reduction of the production of the oil production, the result is going to be a huge economic crisis known as the oil crisis of 1973, which affected especially to the industry that at this point was 100% based on oil. It was an enormous crisis for the Western economy. The consequences were great, as most of the Western countries, the Western capitalism, the Western industrial activities had to convert or reconvert. They started a reconversion process in order to diversify their activities and not depend so much on only one product, oil. Well, and now we have to go to America, to South America, because remember, the USA considered Latin America its backdoor. And remember again the Truman doctrine of intervention. When in the democratic elections in Chile, we are going to Chile now, when in the democratic elections the left-wing parties were winning support, the CIA reported right-wing military coups and dictatorships in order to preserve their influence in the area. As I said, the best example is Chile, but we have many examples all over South America, such as Nicaragua, for instance. In the case of Chile, Chile was up to this moment one of the most stable democracies in South America. Salvador Allende, the leader of the Socialist Party, arrived to power after democratic elections in September 1973. He was a socialist, and he started a set of reforms. Immediately, a coup plotted by the military leaders of Chile and backed by the United States took by force, even bombing the presidential palace. They took the government, Salvador Allende committed suicide, and a cruel authoritarian dictatorship ruled the country until 1990. It's one of the best examples of an intervention of the United States in South America. We can make a parallel point of view of the intervention of the satellite of the Soviet Union, the satellite states, which was more open because their troops were going directly there, and the intervention of the United States in other countries like Chile, which they didn't do it openly, but it was known, and they always intervene, giving weapons, plotting with the CIA. So both of them in order to keep having their influence in their surroundings, in their areas of power. And now we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, which is definitely the most important conflicts, not only of this period, but of the Cold War. The conflict of Vietnam, as I said, is going to be the most important of the Cold War, not only for the terrible human cost, but also due to its international consequences and the consequences inside the US. Up to 1954, Vietnam had been part of the French colony of Indochina. Then the region was divided into countries by the 17th north parallel. North Vietnam, that was a communist regime led by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, that was a dictatorial regime friendly to the US. South Vietnam was threatened by a communist guerrilla. This guerrilla movement was called the Viet Cong. Maybe you've heard about this word, the Viet Cong. That was backed by the North Vietnam, that was also communist, because the North Vietnam wanted the South Vietnam to become communist too. The USA is going to assist South Vietnam, and later in 1965, finally the US is going to send in combat troops by the President Johnson. The Viet Cong used effective guerrilla tactic. The USA, despite the superior technology, chemical weapons, and massive air bombings in the north, was unable to achieve a military victory. By 1968, it became clear that the USA could not win that war. The anti-war movement grew in strength throughout the Western world. In 1969, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States, and peace talk began in Paris. A ceasefire was agreed in 1973, and American troops withdrew. However, North and South Vietnam continued in a fight. 1975, a major offensive of the North led to the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. And in 1976, Vietnam was united as a single country, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. During the Vietnam War, over 2 million people were killed, and millions also were wounded. The war was a tremendous failure for the United States. It caused a lot of unrest at home and anti-US sentiment abroad. Well, for the first time in history, you have to understand that the Vietnam War is going to be broadcast, followed on television. The world could see the images you are seeing now on their televisions. Harsh scenes showed the terrible effects of chemical weapons and reported other war atrocities. As a result, there was a strong international opposition in the war. The reputation of the United States was really damaged. But not only internationally, also at home, because the Vietnam War is going to coincide with the hippie movement and the peace towards movements that are going to invade the mentality of the United States. And also, what's more, Vietnam War is going to be lost. So at the end, all these conflicts, all these loss of lives, all of these Vietnamese that were living in the jungle that didn't have anything to do with the Cold War conflicts were for nothing. All these millions of deaths were for nothing. And all these American young soldiers' deaths were for nothing, because Vietnam became finally a communist regime. I want to finish this video with a song. Please read the lyrics and observe the images which are from the Vietnam War.